Well, good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are. And welcome to this information session about Step 1 survey assessment, which is an integrity and work ethic evaluation. We will jump straight to it, but I wanted to touch on a couple of housekeeping items. Please feel free to use the chat Q&A box to ask questions throughout. And I will leave some time after this very brief session to answer most or hopefully all of the questions. In this webinar, we are really going to focus on a demonstration of the assessment tool. So I come to you with an understanding that you already understand the value of assessment in the workplace, and you're just curious to learn a little bit more about this one tool that's available to you. It's a very cool assessment, as you will see. I am Tatiana St. Germain, and my company is Great People Management, where me and my team help you select, develop, and keep great people. I'm an executive coach and talent assessment expert, and I work with organizations, partner with them to help create workplaces where people actually love to come to work. And we accomplish a lot of our work through the use of assessments, as well as executive coaching and development. Feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn. And like I said, if you have any questions, I'm here to answer them. I don't think that, well, some people, I guess, could say that they've made a conscious decision to hire an underperformer. Interesting things do happen when, for example, you have a employee referral, and you feel compelled that you need to hire somebody when you know full well, you have that gut feel that they're just not going to match your expectations. And then they kind of prove you right. But when you have underperformers on your team, or when you make a decision to hire somebody who is going to be an underperformer, you're actually giving them a raise because you're paying them for a certain level of performance and they only give you half of it. They only produce half and cause you twice as many problems as other people. Did you know that you can eliminate or reduce the risk factor associated with hiring employees? You can reduce or eliminate the bottom 1/3 of your applicant pool. You can screen them out, and that's what the Step 1 survey is going to help you with. It is estimated that 36,000 companies are stolen out of business every year by their employees. People do lie, falsify records, take small things from work, abuse drugs and alcohol, do all sorts of things that they're not supposed to do in the workplace. And it's especially important to assess that if your employees have access to data, to sensitive information, to substances, to money. You really want to be able to screen out, again, the worst of the worst. The selection process, as we look at it, is typically, what we like to look at it is three-legged stool. We evaluate the past, the present, and the future. The past, of course, is the resume, past employment, education, background checks, which background checks are really interesting because they just tell you and show you what they've been caught for. And present, when you interview them, it's going to help you understand how they show up. During the interview, you see them at their best. This is their personality, how they answer questions during the interview, how they appear, did they show up on time? So that really tells you quite a bit about who they are. But if you make a decision just based on the interview, it gives you only a 14% chance of hiring a top performer. And the future leg of the selection stool, if you will, is the one that's very risky and most tricky. This is where we need to evaluate the potential, the job fit, the attitudes. And in this case, so in this conversation, we'll be talking about Step 1 survey. Step 1 survey fits in that attitudes evaluation and behavioral risk evaluation, attitudinal risk evaluation. So that's where it fits in the selection process. approach. All right, so what is the step one survey? The name really speaks for itself. It can be incorporated into your application process and become the step one in your selection process, part of the application. Many companies actually integrate it into their application because it's a very quick 15 minutes to complete survey and it's inexpensive. It will help you reduce hiring mistakes and accelerate the hiring process, again, because we have the ability to integrate with the application. It provides a structured interview process it enhances your interview process because it gives you interview questions you can ask when you get to that next step in the process. It's going to capture some employment history. So for those organizations or some positions where you don't ask a lot of questions on your application, some questions on the step one survey can actually replace questions on the application. That's what we're saying. It's a structured interview and employment history. It also provides you with a risk assessment, helps you perform your due diligence. It is very consistent as long as you administer it to everyone. And arguably, at what level do you think integrity, for example, is not important? And it helps organizations in a dramatic way reduce turnover, especially 90-day turnover. It improves the morale of the team and the company. It impacts organizational culture because you end up hiring and keeping better employees, better of the applicant pool. It reduces your liability and absolutely minimizes and reduces the cost of theft, violence, and absenteeism. So these are very serious issues, and organizations traditionally tend to shy away from dealing with those issues, but largely because of the fear of litigation and really lack of understanding that there are tools available on the market today, like the step one survey, they can actually help you through the process. Step one survey measures integrity. Does a person's attitude match that of honest employees who can be trusted with data, money, sensitive information, and even company time? Substance abuse, this is the propensity toward substance abuse or attitude regarding those people who may use illegal drugs at work. So do they have kind of a very tolerant, lackadaisical attitude, which in some positions it's fine because there's really no access, it doesn't really matter. And that for those positions, you can set the hiring standard a little bit lower. On reliability, we measure attitudes toward being dependable, proven record of dependability. Will they show up on time? And finally, work ethic is again the fourth attitudinal attribute that we measure. Does the person have an attitude toward work that is like the attitude of long-term hardworking employees? Are they willing? Are they wired to put in an honest day work for an honest day pay? And the final measurement here I'm listing on the slide is called distortion. We want to make sure that when we receive the results of the assessment, that we can trust the results of the assessment. Has the person been consistent in their responses? Or did they try to sort of play the assessment and figure out how to answer in a way that's going to give them a leg up? Well, the assessment is much more sophisticated than a typical personality test out there that they might be prepared or even trained to take. With these assessments, they're not transparent, so it's very difficult to figure out where we're going with the line of questioning. And so as a result, the assessment taker will get caught in their own inconsistencies, and as a result, the distortion would be flagged, and it will provide you with a statement on distortion. And I think I might even have a slide here about distortion, so we can talk a little bit more about that. But certainly, if you have a question regarding distortion, you feel free to put it into the chat box or Q&A. So I wanted to talk a little bit more about the specific measurements. The way that we measure the scale is from 1 to 9. And unlike some assessments on step 1 survey, we're looking for higher scores. So caution should be exercised with scores 1, 2, and 3. And I will explain a little bit later why that is when we talk about how this assessment is validated. So on integrity, the higher the score, the higher the respect for property. They're more responsible. They avoid rationalizing questionable behavior, and most likely a 9 will feel terrible about even taking a paperclip from work. Whereas for individuals who are on the lower end of that spectrum, they tend to rationalize larcenous behavior and accept situational perspective concerning theft. And I think that pretty much speaks for itself. Substance abuse. Again, we're talking about illegal substances, usage, distribution, and tolerant behavior toward others who use illegal substances. So individuals on the high end of the scale will condemn illegal drug use. They tend to not rationalize drug use. They don't look at it as situational or like it's not my problem. They really see that as an issue. And on the lower end of the scale, people are very open-minded. So, but as a caution, when I do training on step 1 survey with hiring managers, I do let them know that just because someone scores a 1 doesn't mean that they are a drug user. This assessment is not a replacement for a drug test. However, it does indicate that they have a very open-minded approach, very tolerant. And if they notice some of their coworkers using illegal substances during break, they may feel like, oh, that's fine. To each one their own. And imagine if we're talking about a healthcare facility and they have access to illegal substances and prescription drugs. What could that potentially lead to? You're just increasing the risk and the liability in this case if you tolerate those types of individuals in the workplace, and if you tolerate hiring individuals with lower substance abuse scores. The next scale is reliability. As I mentioned before, it really is about will they show up? And recently, some of my clients have been sharing horror stories essentially about recruiting individuals in high turnover positions, high volume positions. You interview them and you're lucky if they even show up. And if they show up on the first day, they're late. Or after a week, they are missing in action and we don't know what is going on. Well, if they had used the assessment, the step 1 survey assessment, they probably would have gotten a little bit more information about this individual's reliability. Even if somebody's not interested in the job anymore, if they have high reliability score, they will let you know. They have that internal sense of self-accountability. They understand the importance of accountability. They appreciate promptness. And people who are on the left-hand side, again, they tend to rationalize cautious behavior toward authority, may possess a carefree attitude about tardiness, especially. I'm sure you've worked with people who show up late and they feel, or they see that other workers show up late and they don't feel that it's concerning. Well, as leaders in organizations, we know what that leads to. It really impacts the morale of the entire team, not just the productivity of one individual person. Moving on to work ethic is the 4th attitudinal measurement on the step 1 survey. The higher the score, the more reliable they're going to be. They tend to comply with rules and standards, or in the very least, they understand the need for rules and policies and procedures. They also understand the hierarchy. They're typically more respectful. So anything that you typically associate with work ethic, the higher the score, the more the person will demonstrate it in their behavior and attitudes. Individuals with lower scores and beyond work ethic will prefer a great amount of personal freedom. They're fairly careless. They have a very cautious attitude toward authority, or they may be very casual on how they interact with authority figures. And that in itself, again, depending on the position, could represent a concern. Yes, I do have a slide about distortion and what it means, but the main thing to remember about step-on survey distortion is that you should not use unacceptable distortion as a basis for disqualifying a candidate. We still recommend that you take their scores or take their report and use it as part of your interview process, because in the very least, you're provided behavioral interview questions that are going to be helpful in the interview process. Okay. The step-on survey validation and compliance, all of our assessments that we use at Great People Management with our clients have a technical manual. And I recommend everyone who uses or considers to use any type of an assessment should consult assessment provider and ask for a technical manual, because technical manual will contain very important information about validation studies and compliance with guidelines for hiring. You use the assessment for hiring, it's a very litigious environment, and you want to make sure that you comply with Department of Labor standards, EEOC, you're not producing adverse impact on protected groups, etc. And ban the box legislation from 2012, for example, that was part of the EEOC update, caused us to create a separate version of the step-on survey assessment so that we have a version that complies in those municipalities where ban the box is adopted, when you follow the ban the box legislation. And we also have a Canadian version of the assessment. Again, everything, all the information is provided in the technical manual, so you can use this assessment with confidence, even though when you look at some questions, you feel like, oh my goodness, is it even legal, so to speak? I'm doing air quotations, to ask these questions. And the answer is yes. They've been highly scrutinized and validated. And then looking at the 4 attitudes that we measure and why we recommend that you need to exercise caution with scores of 1, 2, and 3. Well, there's a very good reason for that, because the assessment step-on survey is actually validated against attitudes of prison population, recently released prison population. And so the technical manual is probably one of the most fascinating technical manuals that I've read, because it details how closely certain scores correlate with prison population. One interesting fact to point out from that study, from the latest validation study, is that 50% of parolees score 1 in integrity. Isn't that interesting? Half of them score 1, not 1, 2, or 3, because when you combine 1, 2, or 3, we're talking about 70% of them score anywhere between 1 and 3. But half of them score 1 and on integrity. So that's very interesting, and highly recommend to read that and familiarize yourself. And as I mentioned, this assessment is compliant, and all interview questions are safe interview questions to ask during pre-employment, as well as all the questions that are presented to the candidate during the survey are also safe. I wanted to share with you a couple of snapshots from the reports. This is not, I'm not going to show you the full report, but just to give you an idea of how the report is structured. It's fairly easy to read, and it's not too long, so it's not like you're reading a book, but there's 2 main parts to the interview report. Part 1 is direct admissions questions. There is an employment check, employment status, inconsistent responses are going to be flagged, and interview questions presented to clarify that. For example, if your candidate says that they're currently employed and they can start immediately, well, perhaps there's a bit of an inconsistency here, and we need to ask a question there. Employment profile, that's information regarding employment, if they supervised others at work in the past, termination history, summary of what self-admitted questions, direct admissions regarding theft of money, property, data, and time, illegal substance abuse. And it's actually, you might be looking at this and wondering, well, who in the right mind would admit to some of these things? People do admit because they presume that the background check is going to be performed and reference check is going to be performed, so there is no point in not disclosing this information. We also have criminal convictions section. And then, as I promised, the interview questions will be presented to you in this format. And it will even explain why the question is presented. It's because a candidate answered this question in a certain way. Part 2 is about applicants' attitudes. This is where we present to you the score on a scale from 1 to 9. Once again, the higher the better. On integrity, substance abuse, reliability, and work ethic. And the distortion scale, I apologize with this pop-up. Distortion is acceptable for this assessment. It's presented as a statement. And then interview questions will be provided for each of the areas that we measure. A critical issue is identified, then it explains to you why it was triggered and provides you with at least 2 questions. So there's plenty to pick and choose from, and then at the very least, it enhances your interview process. Best practices for utilizing Step 1 survey, of course, use it as early in the process as possible so that you can screen out the bottom 1/3 of the applicant pool. This is not a job matching assessment. This is really a screen out tool. Step 1 survey is designed as a pre-employment assessment and should never be used on existing employees. You might be asking why? Well, that's because the psychological pressure for going in for a new job has already been built into the questioning, to the line of questioning. Employees who are currently in their roles are much more comfortable and they will tend to be more honest to a fault, and their scores may end up being very low, and then you become disappointed about your existing team. Well, that's already built in. We already count on people embellishing a little bit, not being 100% honest. So that's already been built into the line of questioning. And that's why, once again, I can't reiterate this enough, stress this enough. Never avoid the temptation of assessing integrity and work ethic of your existing people. This assessment is for pre-employment only, for outside candidates only. Administered before the interview and before the job offer is made, but as I said, please try to implement it as early in the process as possible so that you can still be choosy with your final candidates. Exercise caution with scores 1, 2, and 3. Pay attention to distortion. Assess everyone to ensure consistency and due diligence in the process. When I work with companies with multiple locations and we find that one location is 100% consistent and compliant with the assessment process, and then this location B is not consistent, when we perform assessment data analysis, we find that the location A will always be more productive, more engaged, and they have higher retention rate and lower turnover than location B. And this is the type of analysis that comes with our service when you use Step 1 survey or any of our other assessment tools. I always recommend, regardless of how tight the labor market is, always strive to maintain a higher ratio, candidate to hire ratio of 3 to 1 or higher. Not always possible, I understand that, especially in highly specialized positions, but that's what we should strive for. Ensure compliance with the established hiring standard. The preliminary standard should be 4, because remember, we're trying to avoid 1, 2, and 3. And it's no more than 1/3 of your decision. No assessment is the magic bullet and all be all. You should always use it as just a data point. You have to consider the interview, and you have to consider the background that this person brings to the table. So we're winding down, and I will take a look. Smiley, if you could look at some of our questions to see if any popped in the chat or Q&A while I'm covering these last couple of slides. So when I say if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. Sometimes when we look at an assessment product and the assessment provider sounds really optimistic about what the tool can do. Well, what we do at Great People Management is we not only provide high quality assessments, we like to measure their impact. We're all about results. So these are some of the real client results. And we track this. This is fairly easy to track in their assessment portal. As an example here, 39% of involuntary terminations scored below in at least one scale. And then we can craft a plan and a new hiring standard with that client. 16% of the voluntary terminations scored below 4. 33% of negative terminations scored below 4 of at least one scale. This was another study, misspelled retention. Retention rate of assessed hires was 85% higher than the retention rate of non-assessed hires. Again, when you have multiple locations, some are compliant, others are not, so we can compare that. 76% of retained hires were 4 and above in all areas. Retained hires scored 4 and above in all areas. That's very significant, and 13% higher than the number of terminated employees in the same score range. 76% of retained hires scored 5+ in at least 3 areas. And when we do ROI, because as I mentioned, step 1 surveys, very inexpensive, very quick to use, it's easy to implement, and it's easy to realize a return on investment. And I typically see 1,000% or more return on investment. So in this case, for every dollar invested, $23.20 returned to the company. And that's what we like to see. And I'd like to conclude with an offer to just the attendees on this webinar, pilot project. If you have an organization, depending on the size of the organization, you may go through 100 step 1 surveys pretty quickly, or maybe it can take you up to a year, but we want to include 100 step 1 surveys, create and set up a branded assessment center portal for you. After the 100 assessments were used, we would like to conduct an applicant pool analysis so that you can see what is the quality of your applicant pool. Do you have a lot of applicants who are in that 1, 2, and 3 range? And maybe we need to come up with a more creative approach to recruiting. Perhaps you need to change the pool you're fishing in. We will do a hiring standard review for the next 12 months and a turnover and cost savings projection, all for $4,900. And this offer will continue to be available to the people that joined our session today. And that concludes our product demo with step 1 survey. Smiler, did we have any questions come in?
No, we don't have questions.
No questions. I see you're unmuted, so did you have a question? I didn't mean to put you on the spot.
Oh, no, it's fine. I'm still trying to wrap my head around this still.
No worries, no worries. So I'm happy to talk more about it. I mean, this was kind of a quick review without getting too deep into any particular scale or how it can be implemented. It's probably slightly different for each company. But yeah, if you have additional questions, you know where to find me. And we'll go ahead and say goodbye for now until we talk again. Have a great day.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.